Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Firstly, what I'll do is set the scene. The year was 2005, southern Iraq, part of Overwatch Battle Group West 1. I was a 24-year-old crew commander of an ASLAV CRV. I conducted numerous leadership courses, being Subject 1 Corporal and also an ASLAV crew commander course prior to that deployment. And I'd been promoted to Lance Corporal for a period of approximately 6 months prior to deploying. We were tasked with security for a key leadership engagement that the battle group commander was conducting with the local Sheikh Raizan, who was one of the key stakeholders of the township of Samoa. And we were located approximately 2,000 metres from the actual key leadership engagement itself. We had a ASLAV patrol consisting of 2 ASLAV 25 gun cars with 25mm chain guns, and also my Type 2, on which I had mounted Mark 19 grenade machine gun. We were parked approximately 180 metres from the outskirts of town, and we were in disused dump in a fan hide, and we'd just blown 2 tyres on the infill into the edge of town. So we were in a little bit of an administrative phase, and we'd demounted and we'd gone to put 2 new tyres on this vehicle. Concurrently, there would have been probably about 20 children had come out to our position to come and try and get water, food, etc. off us. So we were accommodating those children and conducting a little bit of local area engagement and entertaining them concurrent to security and fixing the tyres on this ASLAV. What we did, we just concluded the job, put the bar armour back on that vehicle. And probably about 3 minutes after that concluded, I heard a whoosh, and I thought at first someone had set off a paraflare. First thoughts were, who's set off a paraflare? Why have we done it? The subsequent explosion that was probably about 6 metres away into a berm beside my vehicle indicated there was probably an RPG. The subsequent 2 or 3 explosions within the next minute and a half did confirm to us that it was in fact an RPG. So what we've done, we've mounted up very hastily. We've turned our vehicles faced into the township. We've identified that there's multiple firing positions. There's one firing position that was probably about 45 degrees off to my left at about 190 metres. And there were 2 firers. One had a PKM and an RPG team would jump out from behind the wall, reload behind the wall. Each time they come out, they'd shoot an RPG, engage us, go back into cover, load another round and then fire at us again. To my right, probably at about 60 degrees, there was also another team that was basically in someone's backyard with a herd of goats, of all things, in their vicinity. And what they would do is the PKM was on top of a wall. They would shoot off that wall, and there's also an RPG team in that location, and they would engage us from that location and then go back into cover to be able to reload. Once we've turned around and orientated our vehicles, I had a remote weapon station, which is basically a remote control that operated a system with the Mark 19 grenade machine gun on it, which I could utilise. It was a TV screen, and I could basically put the crosshair on the target. I could laser the target. It would super elevate the weapon, and then I'd have the capacity to engage the target and fire a burst of 40mm grenades into the target area. So once I've got it all ready, I'm jittery. We're about 2 minutes into everything at this stage. What I've done is I've lased the target. The target has presented, fired another RPG. I think we're up to about 7 RPGs into our area at this stage. And the first thing that I did was lased, had the target ready, was preparing to engage. And now we think back to all of the children that were initially in our hide at the start. We basically had a kindergarten in the middle ground between us and where our adversaries were at that time. As I've gone to pull the trigger and fire a burst of grenades, the first thing that I've seen is some type of superhuman Iraqi mum come in with 2 kids and throw them over the same fence as where the enemy were located. It was that split second in time where I had a quick think to myself and I thought, okay, I've got 2 options here right now. The first option was to shoot a burst of grenades into there. The outcome of that would be her, the children, the enemy, all die in that scenario. The second option was to wait, think to myself, okay, her and the children would have already cleared that area, and then take the opportunity to engage the enemy once they had left that location. In my mind, the first thing I thought of was long term, if I engage right now and I know in my heart that that woman and children were still in there. I think that that would have had a long-term effect on me if I had have engaged at that time. So what I did is there was also a third option that resided there. I actually got my rifle and I waited for the target to present and actually engage with my rifle. Not the best shot with my rifle because they bounced back in behind the wall. Being an armoured crewman, it's first and foremost not our primary means of engagement, especially in the heat of the moment. So what I did is I loaded a single 40mm grenade and then loaded that into my grenade launcher on the rifle and fired a grenade into there. After about 3 minutes had elapsed, and I made an assumption to myself that the woman and the children had actually left that location and we were free to engage. Once that had occurred, we weren't receiving effective fire into our location anymore. The patrol commander gave us the order to withdraw from that location. And what we did is we did a sequential withdrawal, supporting each other with the vehicles, and moved back to a location to be able to conduct a reorg. A note as well is that from the position where we were sitting, both ASLAVs had the opportunity to engage with their 25mm chain guns, which would have caused a significant amount of collateral damage, noting that we were firing into a residential area. What we did is they only engaged with the highest calibre weapon that was used on the day was 12.7, and that was from the other Type 2 that was there. They only engaged with their 7.62 coaxial machine guns. That was the patrol commander's order so that we did minimise the collateral damage that we did make within that engagement area when we were engaged.
I think that's, an awesome anecdote. Now, I suppose we chose the team here, and I'll introduce everyone in 2 seconds, but we chose to deliberately start with a sort of a story or an anecdote that literally describes, I suppose, you said how old you were, Tony, and again, I'll get into the introduction in a second, but, as a Lancejack crew commander of 20, young, early 20s, to make those decisions on the fly and genuinely think about long-term consequences. I think today's episode's about ethics. Before I'll pull the, reveal the topic, I suppose. But it's an incredibly interesting anecdote about how difficult and complex the decisions that we're expected to make are going to be in reality, okay? By way of introduction, obviously I'm Captain Todd Lemper, and welcome back to the Cove podcast. The two guests I've got on today, you've just heard from WO2 Tony Campbell, CSM. And I'll refer to him as Tony for the remainder of the podcast, but he's deployed to Timor, Iraq, and he just gave an awesome anecdote from Iraq, and there's many more that will be weaved throughout the episode, and Afghanistan. And he now teaches and designs and teaches command leadership and ethics at ADFA, so the Australian Defence Force Academy, to trainee officers. So there's a body of about 1,200 trainee officers, and he delivers the command leadership and ethics package to them. Also joining me today is Chaplain CHAP Bouzanquet. He joined the Army in 2006 as a soldier, as a medic. He deployed to Afghanistan as a medic on one of the MTFs, and then studied 6 years of theology, a long grind through university and studies, to then bounce through a few units in Army providing chaplaincy support to the first line units, but then spent 3 years in SOCOM before as a chaplain, and he's now the chaplain at RMC Duntroon. So much like Tony designs the ethics package at ADFA, the Padre designs the ethics component at RMC Duntroon. So we're going to talk about ethics, frame some decision making, and have a bit of more of a discussion and discourse about how difficult some of the decisions can be to make. But I suppose I'm going to ask the Padre first. I'm going to ask what is the difference between ethics and morals. But before I do that, we start life, and I suppose we follow rules. That's the basis of our ethics at a more rudimentary level. Rules that include laws and police that enforce laws. I suppose if we already have a binary set of right and wrong described by the courts and laws, why do we need, I suppose, ethics and morality, I suppose?
Hey, thanks, Todd. It's a great question. I think straight off the bat, the ethics versus morals question is the cliche that every good ethics discussion starts with. So thanks for going there. I think ethics is the process in which we decide what is good to do. It's a very action-based concept. Whereas morals, while used interchangeably quite often, and you could probably use ethics or morals in any given sentence backwards and forwards and no one would tell the difference, morals is probably more concerned with who we are. And so as the ethical approach is really concerned with the action, the moral approach is concerned, I think, primarily with what type of human being am I in the moment? I'm existing as a human here, conducting these actions, and what do I bring out of my humanity? It's an existential question, and it's a question of being. And then I suppose why that's important is that anyone can follow a set of rules, as you suggested. We follow rules from a very young age. We learn what is good, bad, right and wrong from our culture and from our upbringing and from our society. But as we grow older, it's the way that we interpret those rules and it's the way that we apply those rules that really becomes a question of our moral character. And so particularly with the new doctrine that's been launched in the last 12 or 18 months and moral character in the ADF, it's a really good discussion as we send our people into the harsh realities of conflict and of warfare. Who are we as Australian soldiers, sailors, aviators in that place, and what do we bring other than just following some rules?
And I think the subjectivity or interpretivism that you talked about before will really shine through in some of the topics we're going to talk about. But I think more importantly to parents, and I'm not one, so I'm not going to profess to talk about this, but just before we got on the episode, Tony's talked about trying to teach your kids to do the right thing, right? It's like a constant struggle, I imagine. But yeah, I suppose how do you go about it with your own kids or, and now young training, not to say that they're kids, I'm just saying like young training officers at ADFA. How do you go about sort of teaching what is right and wrong, I suppose, at a more rudimentary level?
Yeah, thanks, sir. I think when we talk to consequentialism, especially being a father of 3 boys that are out and about all the time, trying to get into mischief wherever they can get into it, I think where we talk consequentialism, when we look at it, people just need a black and white answer for what is right and what is wrong. So I think that's where consequentialism does come into it, in that you can say to them, there is consequence for your action. So if you make the poor decision, you've done the wrong thing, there's a black and white consequence for it. For example, you're going to get in trouble if you do it. If you get a speeding ticket, you get a fine. These things have a very predictable outcome though. So it's very easy to say, hey, there's consequence for your action, so don't do it. When we talk to that within a Western society, I truly believe that we inculcate a version of consequentialism into our children, and then as we grow up and transition into young adults, it's where we start to get a more wider virtue-based system that we start to work with.
Yeah, so in a rudimentary sense, I suppose you're riding a bike along and you crash the bike, there's an instant pain response, and you realise that like doing risky things on bikes is probably not the idea of safety and the way forward, I suppose. But yeah, when we get to a point where we can think a little bit more and develop some more sort of long-term thought and complexity of thought, I suppose we come back to the search there is to some sort of values or a broader ethical theory to guide decision-making.
So what I think is as we get older, we have the ability to be more well-read. We also have an understanding and can seek a lot more resources than what we do as we're growing up. It may not need such a system that's based on consequence because we're a lot more free-thinking. So specifically when we talk to the trainee officers here at ADFA, we introduce them to a version of military ethics, which incorporates duty and virtue ethics. I think that you could make a Venn diagram where we add consequentialism into it, which then forms a nucleus for how our ethics are based and then inculcated as they transition into young adults.
Yeah, so the base of this theoretical pyramid is the consequences of our actions, and then more broadly as we go up to the top tier, the more healthy foods up to the top of the food pyramid, is we're talking about more values-based ethical decision-making. Yeah, I suppose Pato, I'm going to send to you because you obviously teach the topic at RMC, but what's the ADF's approach to ethics, and how do we look at ethics, and what framework is provided for us all to look at ethics?
Yeah, as we join the military, as we put on a uniform, we become members of the profession of arms. And the idea behind any profession is that there is some guidelines. There's a left and right of arc, so to speak. And as we become officers, particularly in the profession of arms, but NCOs, decision makers right across our organisation, we need to have the ability to have confidence in ourselves, and the people around us have to have confidence that we are making ethical decisions. And one of the things we teach the cadets at RMC is that as officers, they are bearing the responsibility. They have the duty to make those decisions, and the decisions are so far beyond just the immediate realm. They have potential to have far-reaching consequences right across our organisation, Army, all the way through to our government and even our Five Eye partners and international partners. And so therefore we need, we can't just have a set of rules that we say, like this, do that. That's good for the first few reps of any new skill that you learn, but you need to be able to build up muscle memory, and you need to be able to build up instinctiveness in any skill that we learn in our organisation. And so the whole approach to ADF ethics is to build up that muscle memory and to rely not just on a set of rules, but rely on the good moral character of the people that we recruit and employ in uniform. And so in a broad brushstroke, that involves understanding what the rules and the laws are, understanding what our duty is in any given situation, and really trying to ascertain what our commander's intent is, what our intent is, what are we trying to achieve, what's the desired outcome here, and then who are we as an organisation in this place bringing about some sort of change, and what are the virtues or what are the values particularly that we have. And finally, there's a process at the end there where we evaluate our thinking, and especially for the really big decisions and the decisions that enable us to have that slow thinking, that deliberate approach to decision making, being able to ask ourselves some really fundamental questions. What shortcuts are we taking? Where have we got some blind spots? What are our biases? Are we assessing all the stereotypes and stuff like that? So that we feel confident in ourselves and the people around us feel confident that as decision makers, we're being responsible.
Yeah, so I suppose duty to an individual standpoint, like duty ethics asks, is the act right in itself? Or, at an act level, is it what can, or more importantly, what can I not do? Whereas I suppose the virtues-based ethics is more complex in that it talks to the person that you are, and I suppose how you look at the world or view the world, and trying to align yourself to the values of the organisation to make good decisions. We use the term good decisions. I mean, there's a level of subjectivity through the entire discourse in ethics, but also in this the conversation we're going to have now. You talked about ethical blind spots and trying to teach, we talk about recognising bias from a academic standpoint, but more so from an ethical standpoint. What do you mean by ethical blind spots?
Yeah, one of the activities we use with the cadets is a fun little activity. I think we've all seen the trolley problem, where you've got the train coming down the tracks and you've got 5 innocent people that are bound up on the tracks, and they're going to get splattered if nothing stops the tram, and you're some sort of conductor or something, and you're on the lever that can shift the tracks to a new set of tracks and save those 5 people, but you're only ever going to on the other set of tracks there's 1 person. And so as you start to think about that, what we tell the cadets now is it actually doesn't matter what your response is for the purposes of this discussion. What I want you to think about is, what's your instinctive bias within that framework? Are you considering the laws? Are you considering the intent or duty or desired outcomes? Or are you considering your values? What's your framework that your bias is in that? And evidently, most people go, well, it's probably my duty to minimise harm. So my bias is duty, and the intent is I'm going to save as many lives as possible. So I'm going to pull the lever. Then you change the scenario a little bit and you add some variabilities, and less people have heard about the...
I still remember now the one person on the tracks is a surgeon and they can save 200 lives or something like that. I think that's injecting that friction and like uncertainty into the discussion that then will go back and forth.
Yeah, that's right. Although in this one we say you're now in a train overpass and there's an innocent bystander who's really overweight, and you can push the overweight person onto the tracks, and that one person will die, but you know that the tram's going to stop and save the 5 people. Now what's your bias? And you see people go, well, hang on a minute, there's an innocent bystander here. I'm probably more concerned with the laws in this situation. It's not so much about the outcomes, but I'm legally not allowed to involve an innocent person in this situation And that would be frowned upon, by everyone involved if I just pushed an innocent person onto the train tracks, even if it was to save a life. And then you change the scenario again and you say, well, what would your bias be if that innocent person was no longer innocent, but they had an AK-47 and ICOM radio and they were streaming live and were, saying praise be to the flying spaghetti monster, and where this is going to be the greatest day in the history of our fake religion. All of a sudden, you see the audience, the cadets, go from, okay, my first gut instinct was to be primarily concerned with intent, and then it was primarily concerned with laws, but now it's maybe value-based. Like, I value the life of a terrorist less than I value the lives of 5 innocent people. Or maybe it's still, I'm in the duty space. I've got the duty as a uniformed person to interject in this situation because, we're inculcated that we're fighting a war. We have fought for a long time, the war on terrorism. And so what we see is, this is a really long answer to your question, but what we see is that we have these instinctive responses that even though the maths in all 3 of those scenarios doesn't change, our instinct has changed as we've considered different elements to the scenario. And therefore, we haven't considered one of the others. And so if you go back and you ask how many of you considered the legal ramifications when you were primarily concerned with consequences, very few people put their hand up. How many people considered the consequences when there was an innocent person involved? Very few people put their hand up. And so what we see is we create ethical blind spots for ourselves. And our worldviews, or the things that feed our character and our experience in life, are going to shape what those blind spots are. And so the idea behind having a holistic model like the ADF's approach to ethics is that we're reducing the risk of ethical blind spots. We're forcing ourselves to ask questions that might step us outside of our bias.
Yeah, I think the gut feel part is good, and to link it back to the development of ethical decision making as we get older and understand consequences, like the gut feel component is, especially in the anecdote you told at the start of the episode, Tony, is like you're sort of, I suppose the gut feel is to bear down on that joystick and fire a burst of 40 mil, right? But like how do we, and now as a WO2, like, and an SSM at a 2 Cav as well, how do you instill the right thing when it's not always certain, but how do you instill the right thing before your soldiers go into elements where it's more complex, uncertain, and all that sort of stuff?
So this is a little trick that I used to use when I was an SSM up at the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. There was 2 little tests that I would do, and I would ask the question. Now, there's no consequence or anything. It's, do you do the right thing when no one's watching? The first one that I would use is the age-old trolley at a supermarket. Are you the one that doesn't return it to the return bay? When we talk an era before you had to get your little token or coin back out of it, or are you the one that leaves it there knowing full well that there's potential that it could cause an accident or it could scratch someone else's prized possession? Do you take the time when no one's watching to take that trolley and return it all the way back, even if it's a couple hundred metres away? The second one that I would also use, I called it the good human test, is that set the scene. You're walking down a beach. It's a beautiful looking beach. In North Queensland, let's just say Townsville, that's where I predominantly spent my time of late.
Capital of North Queensland, yeah. Sorry, go, yep.
So say we're walking down along Paloranda, we're looking out to Magnetic Island, and what we see is there's a piece of rubbish on the ground. We know that the rubbish bin is about 300 metres, so we've got to pick up the rubbish and we've got to walk it all the way back to the bin. Do we pick up the piece of rubbish and keep the beach pristine because we know that we need to keep the environment and keep, as part of the community and for future generations, we conserve the environment? No one's forcing us to do it, but do we just do it by default? So that was a couple little things that I would talk to soldiers, and I'd put them through those and say, what would you do in the situation? When no one's watching you, when no one's telling you what the right thing to do is, will you still do what you think is right? I think that's where our own morals, they link into creating a virtue and holistically probably a worldview in that we believe in the greater good, which I think that's what virtue is truly based on, the belief that what you are doing is right for the greater good.
So less so on the individual, like gut feeling type thing, and more so like having understanding of the consequences on other people. I suppose you would have been through a countless number of mission rehearsal exercises, and Padre before Afghanistan, much the same. Do you think we give enough free reps, beforehand, and prepare people for those decisions before they get to that part? And Tony, I'll throw to you first.
Look, I can speak to a couple of different scenarios that I've experienced through mission rehearsals throughout my career. The first one was when I was a corporal. I think we were on our third deployment to Iraq, so I was a full corporal at this point. And I was a crew commander in charge of a LAV 25, so 25mm chain gun equipped CRV. And what we did, we come up to a defile, which is an obstacle crossing that you approach in vehicles, so you approach in a more secure manner. We pulled 2 gun cars up to secure the opposite bank or the far bank of the defile in order to support the next 2 vehicles to move through. What we had is the subordinate call sign to me, basically my wingman in that situation, called through that they could observe a target but couldn't positively identify this target. So what we've done is I've given my gunner a fire order. My gunner's reported that they can observe that target. I've had a quick look through my optics sight. I could make identification that there was a target there. However, it was slightly obscured by a tree that was in the way. I've given the gunner the command to fire, and we fired on that target. Subsequently, the next 2 vehicles pushed through once that engagement ended. And upon pushing through, what they've done is when they pulled out to secure the far bank, they've then informed us that we've just engaged a UN ambulance with UN painted on the side of the vehicle. So my heart sank. We've spoken as a crew and just go, okay, I truly believe that we have just accidentally committed an act here that is the wrong thing. Now, what happened back in that era is we actually got taken out of the scenario and taken back by question by military police and then questioned by a legal officer, which was one of the best things for us to understand, to come back and to speak the truth from the outset. Yes, we'd made a decision that led to consequence in that we had engaged a target that we at the time believed was a target. However, as it turns out, it was a neutral target, not a target, a neutral stakeholder within the battle space. However, there are situations where this can happen. So to bring that out in training and go through the process of an investigation, it gave us an understanding of basically building our own moral pathways to then have a better understanding of what is right and what is wrong. So that gave us a free hit out in that we had done something that had consequence to it. However, we'd done that in training, and it gave us the opportunity to reflect on that in order to prevent it occurring again in the future.
Yeah, and I suppose, Padre, obviously you've provided service for your entire army career, both as a medic and as a Padre now. But if you look back to your time as a medic providing, because I think the ethical conundrum at that point is, who do I provide spread thin on the ground? Who do I provide support to? I suppose in your MREs, and you as in medics, are incredibly well known for doing really good rehearsals and like going through how to triage and go through an ethical decision making process about who gets care and who doesn't. Sort of what challenges were put to you before you got put into that position in Afghanistan?
I think it might be a little bit of a cheat to say I always found the ethical dilemmas really easy to solve, because when I knew that I was in an ethical situation or an ethical training scenario, I could put my ethical hat on, and I was automatically thinking in terms of, okay, in order to pass this test, in order to pass this exercise, I have to behave ethically. And so you do all your calculations, you'd count, I've got 3 Pri 1s, 3 Pri 2s, 1 Pri 3, who's going to get treated? One of them's an enemy. Does the enemy get treated before the enemy Pri 1 get treated before the friendly Pri 2? All of those sort of things I found relatively not benign. They were good training and good for the muscle memory and building the ability to make those decisions. But the ones that I struggled with the most were much like Tony's example, where you haven't got your ethical hat on. You've got your medical hat on. You're thinking, hey, I'm doing a snake bite, treatment scenario here, or I'm doing a gunshot wound, activity here. And then within that scenario, there becomes an ethical conundrum that catches you off guard. they were the ones that I actually found quite hard to solve because I'd been so fixated and focused on, okay, I've just got to follow my protocols. Okay, this has now thrown a spanner in the works. How do I deal with that? And so I think your example, Tony, is really, really good because you haven't started that activity with, okay, we've got to solve this ethical problem, but you've had the ability to fail ethically in the training environment. And then again, what's even better about your example is you've had the ability to reflect on it afterwards and conduct those hot washes. Not in the training environment, but on ops in Afghanistan, we had a situation where we were working alongside, as a resus team, we're working alongside a Dutch resus team from the Netherlands in TK, and they had a different set of laws. The country has a different set of laws to us, and some of their ethical decisions were just not sat for us. And so sitting in that space between, okay, as an Australian, we would never do that, but that's a Dutch soldier from the Dutch army, the Netherlands army. They are allowed to do that. I remember feeling that tension, and the really important thing about that was our doctor, who is one of the best doctors I served with in my time as a medic, would pull us aside afterwards, after every single resus, and have a hot wash and have just like informal debrief. We'd sit around the RAP. Hey, what did you see? How did it make you feel? What do we learn from that? How can we be better next time we have that same situation come up? And those sort of debriefs that come afterwards help shape the way that you think about those things. And I've got a great debt to the doctor for teaching me how to do those hot washes, and I've brought them into now chaplaincy and sitting one-on-one with soldiers after going through ethical conundrums. I just follow a similar process.
And I think carving out deliberate time, noting that you don't have any time, he took the doctor took a deliberate approach to carving out time to make that happen because it's so important, I suppose. Amazing. The other side of the house is when we talk about working with other nations or working with a host nation and sort of them having a different approach to decision making and ethics and stuff. I suppose, Tony, you've spoken prior about a story where you're sort of trying to guide your own soldiers despite there being some differences in the culture with the host nation.
What I'll talk to, sir, in this situation is whilst we deployed to Afghanistan through 2011 into 2012, our predominant role there was Indigenous capacity building through mentoring the Afghan National Army. Specifically, we worked a lot with the Afghanistan Army Reconnaissance Platoon. So we would spend a fair bit of time out with them. Now, their values and, for want of a better term, their worldview, markedly different to us as Australians. However, in order to bridge the cultural gap between us, there's times where you have to make concession to specific things that they might do because it's accepted culturally to them. However, it might not be compliant with our own values and our own virtue. An example that I'll use is their platoon commander. He basically had a big metal stick that he would use to realign his soldiers when they were doing the wrong thing when we were out on patrol. That was how that platoon commander operated. We could advise that platoon commander that it wasn't in his best interests and probably wasn't the correct way to lead those soldiers by the occasional tap on the back with a big metal stick. It was one of those stretcher legs, those green stretchers. And he would use that to provide some additional guidance to his soldiers if it was required. Now, that methodology not acceptable within the Australian Defence Force and doesn't comply with our values. However, in that situation, if that's the way that he instilled the will to fight within his soldiers and it was acceptable within their organisation, we couldn't tell him any different and we couldn't make him do it differently. However, we could advise that there were better methods to be able to lead his soldiers.
Yeah, I suppose it's hard, in the moment when you're like, oh, that's definitely not right. And it's it's burning at you inside, being like, that's definitely not right. And we talk about, realigning. I'm sure the soldiers really took, that was a pain response for them. But more broadly, if you sort of look at the example further out, there's going to be times where sort of host nations or the enemy will do something that is definitely, you're toying with yourself about whether it's right or wrong, and like you spoke about in the anecdote at the start, you have to live with this stuff for the rest of your life, so it makes it so much harder. I suppose if we shift tack to a bad sort of if we agree that some people don't hold good values or some people aren't ethical, can we, I suppose the question I'll pose to the Padres, can a bad person fit gung-ho, keen as, like absolutely keen to get in there as an infantryman? Can a bad person be a good soldier?
It's a really interesting question. Good soldiering, which we're familiar with that term, good soldiering, I don't think is synonymous with effective soldiering or competent soldiering. Someone who is fit, technically proficient, really effective at their job, I think they can be a tactical a soldier that achieves good outcomes on the battlefield or in conflict. And there's an element that we might say that's a good soldier. But when we start thinking about the term good soldiering and how we've embodied that language as an organisation, good soldiering means so much more than that. And I would suggest that a soldier can't develop good character in the heat of battle. That's done in the build-up and the lead-up to it. You can't surge character. You can't surge ethical aptitude. You need to practice it and train it over a long period of time. And so I would say no, a bad person, someone who's morally bankrupt, can't be a good soldier.
I suppose it talks to that complexity. In a very simplistic scenario, you might argue in a certain act that they're able or capable to do something that we ask of them. But we've just spoken at length for now 40 minutes about how it's way more complex than that, I suppose, yeah. Your thoughts, Tony, on, I suppose you have soldiers throughout your time and that they have varying degrees of ethical decision-making, how they go about ethical decision-making. But what are your thoughts on, whether a bad person can be a good soldier?
What I might do, sir, is I might start first with a bit of a flippant remark I made a couple of years ago as an SSM. We're a little bit hollow on the unit establishment, and as a tank squadron, everybody wants tanks everywhere. I made a bit of a remark where I said I could go into the Sea View on a Saturday afternoon and I could fill this squadron with people who could go to war and fight with us. I said we could get them from there, take them straight through Kapuka, direct recruit them, get them back into the squadron, and we could build a force that's capable of taking these tanks and fighting any adversary. I've reflected a little bit on that comment, and I still truly believe elements of that comment are probably legitimate, because to offer a different opinion on the subject, we have talked about trainability and building the drills and skills. So I see it as akin to the ability to shoot, the ability to conduct drill, the ability to conduct RATEL. These things are a trainable thing. So with time, I think like breaking in a horse, you could eventually get that person and you could morally align them to defence values and then have them prepared to be able to conduct their duties in accordance with what our ethical system is based on.
And I think with the widening of the sort of applicant pool and all the initiatives coming out of some of the recruiting and retention issues, solves or the way we're approaching that, it is going to be the case that we have a wider pool and there's going to be more breaking in, I suppose, to use your example. But sorry, Padre, you were going to jump in?
And I think it might not be the most popular view, but I think that character can be developed. Like we do character development activities all the time and we assume that character can be developed. I think that fundamentally people's character can change and it doesn't change necessarily by slapping some rules and some external structures around an individual. But as we grow and mature from adolescence into young men and women, our character does change and develop and strengthen. And I think if you provide the right environment for people to develop into the moral character that we want and we need within our organisation, I'm a firm believer that process can happen. And someone who might have a bad character or be a bad person from a societal standpoint at one point can grow, can change and can mature into what might be seen as a good person from a societal standpoint. And hopefully through that same time they're developing excellent tactical proficiencies and leadership skills that enable them to get the job done when we need it most. But Tony, I want to ask you a question. You mentioned before that you are particularly inclined to think in terms of virtue theory or virtue ethics. From your perspective, what does that look like on a day-to-day in uniform?
I think that it's been developed over a 24-year period, Padre, in that we're in the ADF. We are bound by rules which looks to a duty ethics approach to it. When we do couple it with virtue, we sit there in this conundrum where one competes against the other as to what we truly believe is the right thing. So to cite an example is that I might disagree with a specific rule. However, with the commensurate rank that I have in the ADF, I'm there to ensure that people follow that rule. I'm there to instill the standards and make sure the discipline of the organisation is enforced. That can put you in a conundrum where you're at odds with your own personal belief in a virtuous sense versus the duty-based ethical system in that you might disagree with something, however, you will still ensure that you enforce those standards. And that also incorporates the virtuous model in that you are doing what is right for the greater good, because organisationally that's what builds our capability.
And I suppose it's like you've obviously honed your skills over 25 years, right? And you've got it absolutely dialed. Tony, you're good to go. But look, for people who, when we teach, and I mean, we've got two guests joining me that teach both sides of the officer training continuum. When we're trying to teach people that don't have 25 years of experience and haven't got it dialed, I suppose I'll go back to the Padre. But like, how do we teach that? Incredibly difficult. But how do we go about it?
Yeah, I had the great privilege of doing 3 months of study over, not over in Florida. Thanks to COVID, I had to do it online and reverse cycle. My flights got cancelled to Tampa, Florida with the Joint Special Operations University. But they taught a really good series of modules, advanced chaplains modules, and particularly on ethical leadership advisement. They've got 6 soft ethical truths for the US SOCOM, and a couple of them, without going into all of them, but a couple of them are that moral character is neither inherent nor fixed. People are not as ethical as they think they are, and that all of the ethical considerations that we apply to defence or to the military context, that needs to be realistic in training. And so when we start to think about how do we develop virtue and how do we develop an ethical code that aligns to our virtue, our temptation is to then say, well, immediately straight off the bat, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. And we fall into this relativism space or this subjectivism space because virtue can be really subjective. But actually what we need to do is align ourselves to our organisational values and then recognise that, like Tony was saying, those values might be different to our own personal values, but how do I sit in that space? And so since the start of virtue ethics or virtue theory, with Plato and then Aristotle as one of his students, one of the great ways of developing virtues is to find the perfect example of what that who embodies that virtue that you're seeking after. And so one of Aristotle's things was to look out for those mythological people like Hercules and Odysseus and these exemplars of virtue from mythology, and say, well, okay, if that's the perfect person, the demigod style person, through a reflection process, how can I be more like them? How can I build my virtue to be more like them? Another virtue theorist, Paul of Tarsus, he would often say, imitate me as I imitate the virtuous person. Follow me as I follow the virtuous person. And so both of those models of imitation, or both of those models rather of virtue theory, really talk about moderation, building habits. They talk about being rational and not erratic in your thoughts and responses and emotions. They talk about imitation, and all of that leads to, has to lead to flourishing and has to lead to the quote unquote good life. And all of those things can be practiced. All of those things can be developed. And in that sense, the training that we do can't be binary. So bringing all that together, the training that we do can't be binary. It needs to be integrated into our full mission profiles or our mission rehearsals so that it's realistic. It needs to be, and ethics needs to be part of our commonplace conversations. We need to have those conversations where we discuss preposterous and outlandish ideas, even if we'd never do them, because they help train us how to think and how to behave as a group and how to have shared values and shared virtues in our organisation.
And I think, I suppose what we're trying to get at for the entire episode, and to somewhat sum it up, is that, thinking about what I can and cannot do, more importantly, what I cannot do, is one level of decision-making process you should go through. But I suppose lifting it up a little bit and really having a look and taking that time to reflect, and leaders giving the opportunity to really hot wash or go through a AAR to really flesh out like why we thought like that, where our blind spots are and our biases exist. I suppose to ask the inevitable question is who we are as an actual person, and can we live with that long term? Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast, Padre and Tony. It's been absolutely awesome.
Hey, thanks, Todd, for having us on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about a bit of a hobby horse of mine, ethics, and looking forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks very much for the invite today, sir. It was great to bring a bit of coalface candour into the conversation. Happy to come back anytime, as I think this is an excellent tool to project out to the wider audience across Army and even the wider ADF, discussing the big subjects that we can.
Thanks, Tony, and I think your next episode will be called Coalface Candour, so that should be awesome. All right, thank you very much. Thanks, gents.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.